Last week, we tackled the old saying that volume is king, and we broke down the top running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends based on the amount of volume they received last year. But this week, we look to put that old saying to rest, because now we jump into the efficiency point of it. And we move forward looking to answer the question, in today's NFL and fantasy football, is it really that the running backs who get the most touches are the most valuable that we should be looking at? Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Today we continue moving forward with my volume versus efficiency series, and once again we'll be talking about the running backs. Now, last week when we talked about the running backs, it was all about the volume. This week we got new categories and we're talking about efficiency instead. And then next week we'll go ahead and break it all down once again, and we're going to be talking about the differences between each position and the top players that saw a dramatic change from volume to efficiency, and what does that mean for fantasy football drafts this year. If you're enjoying this series, hit the like button for me, subscribe if you're new to the channel, and consider purchasing our 2024 fantasy football draft guide. This thing is just packed full of fantasy football knowledge. If you like what you're seeing in these videos, taking the next step in your fantasy game with our fantasy football draft guide is an absolute must. And I'll be the first to tell you, from a volume and an efficiency standpoint, the Fantasy Headliners Fantasy Football Draft Guide is the best in the industry. And there's a link down in the description below where you can go order yours right now, and it's already available, and there's information that continuously updates all the way until week 1 of the regular season. Get yours ordered right now so you don't miss out on any of the prep time to dominate your leagues in 2024. And just a quick reminder, the only running backs that we are discussing this week and that we discussed last week are the running backs that had over 200 carries last season. So if you feel like someone did really well in a specific category and you don't know why you don't see them here, it's because they didn't have over 200 carries. All right, first category that we're going to discuss is yards per attempt. And I know a lot of people will say this is kind of a faulty category and doesn't tell you the entire story of any given player. And I absolutely agree with that. When talking about yards per attempt, you definitely need to use it with a combination of other things to really determine how efficient a running back is. And when you see a guy like Christian McCaffrey and Kyren Williams at the top of this list, it's not surprising whatsoever. But James Conner being number 3 overall may shock some of you. When James Conner was healthy last season, he played very well. And that's saying a lot because he was in an offense that not a whole lot of people expected anything from last season. And they have Trey McBride coming back after his breakout year last season, and they drafted Marvin Harrison Jr. Now, maybe with a full healthy season of Kyler Murray, this offense will become more dynamic in 2024, which would be great for James Conner because we saw some really nice efficiency last season in an offense that may not have been as explosive. So if that efficiency can continue, that's great. But Trey Benson is waiting in the wings, and if for some reason James Conner cannot stay healthy, Trey Benson is going to be taking his shot in this offense instead. So James Conner is a guy that his volume wasn't great last season, and we saw that last week, mainly because he was hurt. But from an efficiency standpoint, there's going to be a lot to talk about in this video. And I think it's also good to see in this category that yards per attempt don't just translate to fantasy points either. Because when you take a look at a couple of the top guys here, Raheem Mostert, obviously great season last year, but then you take a look at a guy like James Cook after him, and even a guy like DeAndre Swift. From a fantasy standpoint, both of these guys were super inconsistent with their fantasy output. So just because they were running for a lot of yards per play doesn't necessarily mean that they were putting up huge fantasy points either. And it can be said the other way around as well, because Travis Etienne and Rachaad White, who are near the bottom of this list, had really good fantasy seasons last year. So yards per attempt, absolutely. Let's consider it and let's take a look at it. But some of the upcoming categories are really important to combine with yards per attempt to paint the entire picture. Yards after contact per attempt. And I really like this category because this shows you how hard these running backs are actually working out there. And a lot of times this also helps us figure out from a perspective of, hey, are guys getting hit and going down right away? Is that the offensive line's fault? Are they able to push through it? Finding out different things about what players do with the ball after touching it is exactly where we find our fantasy points. And for those of you that have bought our draft guide in the past, my dynamic running back rating does take some of these things into factor and has really helped find some big breakout candidates every single year since I've been doing it. James Conner led the way last season in this category, 3.93 yards after contact per attempt. The next closest player, Breece Hall, was only at 3.43. But this once again is why we utilize all these categories together, because Breece Hall, when you take a look at his yards per attempt last season, 10th overall is not bad. That's where he was at in that category, but he is 2nd overall in yards after contact per attempt. And this is where we start to jump into the breakout potential candidates, because in a bad offense where defenses didn't have a whole lot to worry about in the passing game, Breece Hall was still ultra efficient on the ground. For those of you thinking that Derrick Henry still doesn't have the juice, this category shows us he absolutely does. He finished 11th in yards per attempt, but he finishes 6th in yards after contact per attempt. Once again, another fantastic season where this dude was absolutely rolling over defenders. And this helps us pinpoint a little bit more some of those inconsistencies as well. When we talked about James Cook and DeAndre Swift a minute ago, they finished pretty high in yards per attempt. But when they got to the second level, that is where things became a concern. The offensive lines for Buffalo and for Philadelphia last year were not all that bad. Philadelphia having probably the best offensive line in all of football. So they were able to get to the second level with ease. But once they got to the second level and they started initiating that contact with defenders, they were going down a little easier than what we would like. Because James Cook went from 5th to 22nd overall, while DeAndre Swift went from 7th to 28th overall in yards after contact per attempt. Avoided or missed tackles per attempt. Either way that you want to look at it. This is another great category to utilize when looking up efficiency of any running back. I want to see how many potential tacklers are missing on these running backs, because that really exudes the type of dynamic running back that we're looking for to reach upside. And would you look at that? At the top of the list, once again, is James Conner. And a lot of you are going to be looking at this list, and it's going to make you want to buy into James Conner. And I absolutely get it. Looking at this list, I feel really good about him this season as well. The only thing that worries me is just the injuries, not being able to stay healthy and on the field. So if you're interested in investing in James Conner this season, which I do think you should be, you probably should handcuff him with Trey Benson to just ensure, hey, if James Conner misses time, which over the course of his career, it looks like that's likely to happen, I've got the guy that could end up replacing him. Raheem Mostert had a fantastic season last year, but Kenneth Walker being tied with him for number 2 overall in this category is something to keep in mind as we go through the rest of this video. Kenneth Walker, like James Conner, experiences some concerns when it comes to his injuries. But there's one thing that we'll dive deeper into with more videos in the future, is that Kenneth Walker, when it comes to an efficiency standpoint, absolutely should be the number 1 running back on this team, and it shows. Zach Charbonnet is a good backup, but he doesn't really touch Kenneth Walker when it comes to his potential upside. Bijan Robinson, the higher he finishes in all of these categories, the better you should feel about his potential breakout this year and drafting him higher in your fantasy drafts. But Travis Etienne coming after him is definitely a guy I want to talk a little bit more about for a second. Now, he finished pretty low in yards per attempt. Obviously, we already discussed that, hey, that category doesn't make or break people, but 3.78 yards per attempt is not good enough, and maybe a little bit of improvement from the offensive line can help with that. Yards after contact, same thing, 15th, about middle of the pack when we talk about these running backs here in this video. Not good enough, needs to be a lot better. But tied for 4th in tackles avoided per attempt. Now, this is where you see the true dynamic playmaking of Travis Etienne, because even though he wasn't breaking a lot of yards after first contact was made, he was making a lot of guys miss. And if he's making guys miss, that is still giving us more opportunity for more yards. And when you combine these 3 categories together, the one thing that it also tells me is that Travis Etienne was getting hit very close to the line of scrimmage. And with Trevor Lawrence and the offensive weapons that they had there last year, that should not be the case. So hopefully this year they can find a more balanced attack. Trevor Lawrence can take another step forward instead of another step back, and his passing game is much improved, so the run game can also improve as well. Now, tackles avoided per attempt is a really good category that lets me show the one-on-one dynamic playmaking of any running back. Because when you talk about yards per attempt, that could be hurt because your offensive line sucks, maybe your passing game isn't good as well, and you're stacking the box with a lot of defenders. When you talk about yards after contact per attempt, that always could be a little bit lower if, once again, you don't have a whole lot of weapons around you and defenders are collapsing on the run game. Because if you have a lot of defenders hitting you at one time, they're making contact with you, but you may not be picking up a lot of yards if they've got guys helping. But avoided tackles per attempt definitely shows us when you're in those one-on-one playmaking abilities, are you picking up the extra yards? And seeing guys at the bottom of this list, like a Rachaad White, like a Saquon Barkley, like a Joe Mixon, like a Josh Jacobs, guys that have an opportunity to be fantasy viable performers, and not just fantasy viable, but top tier options this season, we need to see this area improve a little bit more for them. Now, Barkley, Mixon, and Jacobs all have different teams this year in completely different scenarios that absolutely could make this a much better category for them. But once again, this is another efficiency area that Rachaad White was very, very poor in. And we're going to discuss that more the rest of the video. All right, let's go ahead and jump on over to the passing game. And just like with volume, we included some passing stats to take a look at those running backs that give us all around value on the ground and through the air. And we'll start with yards per target. Take a look at James Cook at the very top. And right afterwards, Kenneth Walker. Now, Kenneth Walker was not a guy that received a ton of volume in the passing game, but when these numbers eventually start to even out, we'll see when he was given work, he was pretty darn successful. James Cook at the very top is a guy that he did okay in the passing game last year. He had a few too many drops. When he actually caught the ball, he did very well, and that's why a lot of us were kind of clamoring for him to see more of that work. But with Ray Davis on the roster this year, is he going to lose some of that pass catching work and maybe not get the type of targets he saw last season? No one is shocked by a Rachaad White, a Christian McCaffrey, or a Travis Etienne. But once again, Derrick Henry, he has been fabulous in the efficiency portion of all passing categories for a few years now. And one of the reasons why I continue to say, why aren't we giving him more targets? He gets so many touches on the ground that it ends up being okay, and if it offsets things. But maybe this is the year, all right? When you take a look at this Baltimore offense, I definitely think that they can be much more efficient than what Tennessee was at times. But when you take a look at the weapons, they're kind of, lacking the big playmakers, right? You definitely have Zay Flowers, who could take a step in year two. But then you have recently extended Rashad Bateman, who hasn't really shown up at this point. We're hoping for a breakout. You've got Mark Andrews, who has been a pretty decent fantasy tight end over the course of his career. He just misses too many games. So if we were to experience any of those issues, maybe we do see a few more dump-offs to Derrick Henry this year than what we've seen in the past. Now, I don't weigh yards per target way too heavily because a lot of running backs receive targets that are actually negative yards. Those screen passes or little swing passes out of the backfield are targets that are actually behind the line of scrimmage. And because of that, they end up starting with negative yards on their target. So I take a look at this to really find those guys that are being utilized with specific pass catching routes that are utilized over the middle or outside portions of the field. When we move on to these other categories, we start to see a little bit more about the guys that truly are making a difference with the ball in their hands. Okay, yards per reception. And this is where we start to find a little bit more in terms of the big playmakers, because when we just took a look at yards per target, I mentioned those targets in the backfield are going to negatively affect those. But then when you see those yards per reception, we need to find, okay, who are the guys that are getting a lot of targets of maybe negative or low yardage, but their yards per reception is a lot higher, which means they're busting some big plays. And that comes up more in just a minute. But James Cook, once again, at the very top of the leaderboard. Now, his stats are going to end up being pretty low for yards after the catch per reception because he was first in targets and he's first in yards, but those two numbers are pretty darn close together. Whereas you got a guy like Bijan Robinson. He was 10th in yards per target, but he's 5th in yards per reception. That's perfect because he may be running routes all over the field. He may be doing those swing passes out of the back. He might be doing an angle out of the backfield. He might be utilized in the slot or motion out into the slot. A lot of different things that he could be doing, and he's utilized in that passing game, but it means he's picking up a lot of yards regardless of where the target is. But that's where guys like Joe Mixon and Raheem Mostert underwhelmed quite a bit because in terms of yards per reception, 12th and 13th. Okay, not bad, but they were 8th and 9th when it came to yards per target. Now, this is where we really bring it together. Now, one difference I want to make sure everyone knows is that when you're talking about targets, yeah, it might be a target that is in the backfield, but it's just a target. He didn't catch it. So the yards per target and the yards per reception aren't necessarily going to equal the yards after the catch per reception because now we're only talking about the balls that were actually caught. And Kenneth Walker, who was a must-have for me last season, is here at the top of the list once again. Maybe not a ton of volume in the passing game, but when you have the vertical threats in that offense, like DK Metcalf, like Jackson Smith-Njigba, like Tyler Lockett, is going to make Kenneth Walker's lower volume play a lot bigger because there's not going to be a whole lot of people that are going to be keeping an eye on him when they have playmakers all over the rest of the field. Derrick Henry, once again, a guy that isn't going to get a whole lot of volume in the passing game, but when he does get that volume, he's tough to bring down, and this guy is picking up a lot of yards after the catch. Again, I highly doubt we see a huge increase in his workload this season in the passing game. He's getting a little bit older, and I doubt Baltimore is going to give him 400 touches in a season. But if you can give me 350 touches and split that up between carries on the ground and like 50 receptions on the year, we've got ourselves a top fantasy performer. Now, Jahmyr Gibbs does not show up on this list because he did not have more than 200 carries last season. But his teammate David Montgomery does. And I actually think that's a good thing for us to look at David Montgomery instead of looking at David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. Because Jahmyr Gibbs and his amazing playmaking ability overshadows David Montgomery right now. And we're going to talk about his score at the end of the video. But he's number 4 here in yards after the catch per reception. Showing that, hey, Jahmyr Gibbs, he's the dude in this offense that absolutely can touch the ball and score from anywhere on the field. But don't forget about me because I'm pretty darn good as well. Christian McCaffrey may have scored really low in this category, but I really don't care. He's still the number 1 overall player heading into 2024. But guys like Saquon Barkley and Tony Pollard, running backs that have been known for their pass catching ability in the past, just not performing in that area last season. And it's one of the reasons why I have talked about number 1 with Saquon Barkley, his ceiling being a lot lower than what people expect. Now, the offenses are completely different. What he is in now is way different than what he was in with the New York Giants. And his efficiency numbers, they should come up this year given the offensive weapons that are around him. Now, I don't know if the volume will tick up. The efficiency could, but once again, we want to keep an eye on that. And with Tony Pollard, he just wasn't utilized correctly that last season in Dallas. They tried to turn him into that handed off, run him between the tackles type of running back instead of finding him ways to get open in space and then utilize his playmaking ability afterwards. And these numbers that you see here in the pass catching game absolutely reaffirm that. All right, 2 more categories to discuss: fantasy points per snap and fantasy points per touch. And we're going to start with snaps to begin with. Now, this stat I like because it shows us that, hey, this player may be on the field an awful lot, but it doesn't necessarily mean he's being put in a position to score a ton of fantasy points. Now, what we do is we take the total fantasy points for the year and we divide it by how many snaps they ended up playing. And it's great for guys that score really high and play a lot of snaps because we know that their fantasy production is going to be pretty even across the board for how often they are on the field. The more often they're on the field, yes, that's more opportunity for them to score points, but it means they're actually scoring the points compared to how often they're being put out there, which is good for guys like Mostert, McCaffrey, David Montgomery is pretty high here, Derrick Henry, because those are all running backs that are utilized pretty often. But then when you get to the bottom of the list and you see a guy like Saquon Barkley in the same atmosphere as Chuba Hubbard, it's extremely concerning. And again, he's going to be completely different. The atmosphere, his team that he's on now, the fantasy perspective, all of it is much different than when he was with the New York Giants. But it's still not great to see. Also, Devin Singletary being at the very bottom of the list is also a concern for me and something that I have spoken out about quite frequently this offseason and something that we'll touch base on a lot more this offseason as well. All right, and lastly, points per touch. And you're taking the amount of fantasy points that they scored over the year and dividing it by how many touches they ended up having. Now, this is a good stat when we're taking a look at, yeah, they're on the field an awful lot. Okay, they're getting the touches, but how much are they doing with those touches? So it's a little bit different in points per snap where, hey, they're on the field an awful lot. Are they getting fantasy points equivalent to how much they're on the field? Hey, they're getting a lot of touches. Are they getting fantasy points equivalent to those touches? It helps us with their upside. And I think that we can all agree that the names at the top of this list are all guys that have a lot of upside when they touch the football, like Bijan Robinson, who didn't get nearly as many touches last year as he should have, but when he did very well. McCaffrey, Mostert, Williams, Breece Hall, again, a lot of guys, a lot of fantasy production, but when they had the ball in their hands, they did a lot with it. And you see a jump in a guy like Saquon Barkley, where he was at the very bottom of the list for a while, and he's worked his way back up to the mid portion of the list. So yeah, he was a guy that was playing a lot of snaps last season, but he wasn't getting a ton of fantasy points for how often he was out on the field. Missed opportunity. But when you gave him the ball, he was at least doing something with it at that point. But then you see a guy like Derrick Henry right below him. And I've talked up Derrick Henry in this video and the fact that he could have some outstanding upside this season. But last year, for as often as he was on the field and for as often as he was getting touches, his points per touch are a lot lower because his upside just wasn't there. Whether it be he wasn't scoring long distance touchdowns or he wasn't scoring as many touchdowns as we would have liked. Those are the things where the big plays were really limited for him last season. And that is what caused that number to be a lot lower, even though a lot of these other numbers look pretty good. All right, now we're moving on to the final score. And once again, I take all of the numbers that we've talked about in this video. I average them out, and the lower the score, the better, because it means the running back was more efficient across all of these categories today. And this video has already taken a lot longer than I anticipated because your boy loves to talk, but let's go ahead and try to run through all of these categories really fast. McCaffrey and Mostert, absolutely no shock that either of those guys were this high. Then you get to a guy like Kenneth Walker. Absolutely love the upside that he offers because how efficient he is with the football in his hands. We just need him to stay healthy. Take a look at Breece Hall here. Breece Hall is a guy that was ultra efficient last season in a really bad offense. Imagine if he keeps this efficiency in a better offense with even more volume than what we saw the year before. David Montgomery, he may have Jahmyr Gibbs there, but we cannot pass on the fact that when David Montgomery gets touched, he is still going to A, score touchdowns because Detroit's in the red zone all the time, and B, he does a lot with the touches that he gets. Maybe he's not an RB1 that a lot of people would like, but he's still a solid RB2. And then right behind him, James Conner. Talked about him a lot. Ultra efficient when he gets the touches. Injury is the big concern. If you draft him for the efficiency, back him up with Trey Benson. Bijan Robinson, he falls into that second tier. Just missed out on being in that first tier of efficiency. I think we can all agree that with Kirk Cousins and better play calling this year, he'll be at the top of the list in 2024. Derrick Henry and Kyren Williams right next to each other. Derrick Henry still shows that efficiency for a guy that has a lot of carries under his belt. And he's going to get quite a bit of carries again this season. Don't give up on him. If you think he's lost the juice, I guarantee he hasn't. Because last season, he showed it still in a really poor offense that just keyed on the run the entire time. Kyren Williams, when you take a look at him, you have to dissect a couple of different areas. And I'm going to look at my screen when I talk to you, because when you take a look at Kyren Williams in the rushing categories, he was 2nd, 5th, and 6th. But in the receiving categories, he was 22nd, 15th, and 9th. 7th in points per snap, 3rd in points per touch. Now, the reason that you see a little bit of a lower score here is because he just wasn't utilized all that much in the passing game last season. It's his work on the ground. Kyren Williams is going to be one of those guys that we've debated about in the past. Guys that do really well on the ground, but don't get a whole lot of work in the passing game. So is he truly an upside RB1 type of player? The numbers here show me, yeah. Even if he doesn't get the work in the passing game, he's still going to be really, really good on the ground, which leads to amazing upside. For as bad as James Cook looked last season, for as little as he was used, and for unfortunately the roller coaster of a season he had with his inconsistencies, still scores pretty high in this listing, and why I feel like he should get another shot at the full-time job this year. Travis Etienne, not great in terms of efficiency last year. Some of that can be attributed to the fact that he was kind of injured down the stretch. Let's see how he comes out this season. And Rachaad White, there's a pretty big jump here from 9.75 for Travis Etienne down to 12 for Rachaad White. That's a pretty large gap that actually should have put Rachaad White down into the orange instead of leaving him here in the yellow. All right, this list here can be attributed to a lot of guys that see quite a few touches, but unfortunately, for whatever reason, haven't seen a lot of efficiency with them. So when you take a look at a guy like Isaiah Pacheco, he concerns me. And when I look at him, because of the volume that he gets in this offense, with them still running the football, not a bad like low-end RB2 option, but the high-end upside that he offers is probably pretty low because he's not super efficient. So if we're drafting Isaiah Pacheco, we're drafting him to be a safe part of our roster and not the winning portion of our roster. Jerome Ford, a lot is going to depend on Nick Chubb, another guy that was not ultra efficient last season, but when you take a look at the work he did in the passing game, definitely could be like a flex option in PPR leagues. Joe Mixon, much better situation this year, was not super efficient last season. Hopefully some of that volume that we see this year brings some more efficiency with it, and if it does, big year incoming. Najee Harris. Jaylen Warren is not on this list, but if he was, he would blow Najee Harris out of the water, and I plan on doing more episodes taking a look at the guys that maybe didn't have over 200 carries, but maybe had been just as efficient as some of these guys, and then comparing them. DeAndre Swift and Josh Jacobs, also in different scenarios this season as well. However, with DeAndre Swift, he put together a small stretch of good games last year with a really, really good offense and a really, really good offensive line. He's got a little bit of an unknown this year with his offense, but there is going to be some upside there with Caleb Williams and crew, but the offensive line will not be as good as he had last year. And for Josh Jacobs, he should be a lot more efficient with a lot better quarterback in Green Bay. Now, as we take a look at the bottom category of players here, I'm sure Saquon Barkley was not on your bingo list of being one of the worst efficiency running backs in all of football last season. I expect that to change in Philadelphia this year. I expect him to be inside the top 10 running backs. I like his potential. I definitely am just keeping an eye on if that efficiency gets a whole lot better, because once again, take a look at a guy like DeAndre Swift, wasn't super efficient in that same Eagles offense last season. Eagles offensive line is going to be a little bit different with no Jason Kelce. Does that make a difference? Singletary and Chuba Hubbard are both guys that could end up losing touches to more dynamic playmaking rookie running backs that have been drafted this year, especially given how bad they were in efficiency last year. Tony Pollard is in a new situation that unfortunately I don't think is a whole lot better than the situation he was utilized in last season with Dallas. How Tennessee uses Tony Pollard will make a big difference. If they're going to give him the ball between the tackles and try to treat him like Derrick Henry, it will be bad again this year. Javonte Williams, definitely a guy to keep an eye on. That Denver offense last year, up and down, changing quarterbacks, what have you. Also, these numbers are less than a year removed from a huge knee injury back in 2022. So 2024 definitely could be his year to kind of step back up, because these efficiency numbers that we see here were way different than his rookie season when he was a stud. All right, Headliner Nation, this video was super long, but hopefully you found it super informative, because this was a fun one to record. Make sure you stay tuned for the rest of this series. Wednesday, Friday, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday next week as well. I've got tons of great content coming for you. I even wrote down some more show ideas while I was in the middle of recording, because I was like, hey, that would be an excellent idea. But for now, I'm gonna go ahead and get on out of here. If you like and appreciate the content, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you're new here, and then make sure you turn on those bell notifications. Anytime we drop new content or go live, you'll be notified right away. Don't forget to buy your draft guide, and if this video gets 800 likes, I'll pick someone from the comment section below to give a free draft guide to. Headliner Nation, I'm gonna get out of here. Peace out, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.